In 1962, the United States Army published a field manual for a weapon system, and buried inside it was a pair of numbers that should never appear in the same document. The first was the accuracy. The round had a dispersion measured in hundreds of meters. You aimed at a road junction, and you hoped to land somewhere in the same neighborhood. The second was the lethal radius of the warhead, also measured in hundreds of meters. Read those two figures together, and you understand something the manual never states outright. This was a weapon that could not reliably put distance between itself and its own effect. The men who fired it were, on paper, standing inside the outcome. Their training did not emphasize marksmanship. It emphasized how fast they could leave. Now, you have probably heard this thing called a nuclear pistol, a handheld atomic gun. Search that phrase, and you will find a decade of forum posts and video thumbnails swearing the Cold War produced a sidearm that fired a nuke. It did not. That weapon never existed in any arsenal at any point. What existed was stranger: a three-man crew, a tripod, a steel tube, and a warhead. A single soldier could pick up and carry. It was not a prototype, and it was not an experiment. It was mass-produced, issued to frontline units on 2 continents, and kept in service for a decade. It remains the smallest nuclear weapon any nation has ever fielded. To understand why anyone built it, you have to start with a piece of ground: central Germany, between the East German border and the city of Frankfurt. 2 corridors of low hills and open farmland, the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain. Everywhere else along that frontier, the terrain fights an army: forest, ridgelines, river valleys that funnel armor into places it does not want to go. Not here. Here the ground opens up. It is the one stretch of Western Europe where a mechanized force can move fast and keep moving. Every NATO planner in the 1950s looked at that map and saw the same thing: an invasion route the landscape had already surveyed for them. The problem was the arithmetic waiting on the other side of it. Soviet and Warsaw-pact forces in Central Europe held a decisive advantage in armor and in divisions available at short notice. NATO's own exercises kept producing the same answer. Conventional defense of the corridor was not a difficult problem. It was an unsolvable one. There were not enough tanks in Western Europe. There was no realistic plan to build them fast enough, and everyone in the room knew it. So the Eisenhower administration made a choice that shaped the next 20 years. If you cannot match an enemy soldier for soldier, you match him in yield. The doctrine was called massive retaliation, and the logic was brutally simple. Any serious Soviet move into Western Europe would be answered not in kind, but with strategic nuclear force. You did not need to win the tank battle. You needed the other side to believe that starting the tank battle ended their country. It was a coherent policy. It also had a hole in it, and the hole sat exactly where the shooting would actually happen. Massive retaliation operated at the level of capitals and bomber fleets. It said nothing useful to a captain holding a ridge outside Fulda with 200 men, watching an armored column come over the rise. He could not request a strategic strike. That decision lived thousands of miles away, inside a chain of command that measured its response in hours he did not have. There was a gap between the doctrine and the dirt, and the Army decided to fill it. You can measure how radical that was by looking at what nuclear delivery meant at the time. The state-of-the-art was the M65, a 280mm atomic cannon nicknamed Atomic Annie. It worked. In 1953, it fired a 15-kiloton shell across the Nevada desert and detonated it 7 miles downrange, the only nuclear artillery shell ever fired from a gun. But look at what that took. The M65 weighed more than 75 tons. It moved on 2 tractors, one at each end, steering independently like a fire truck. It needed roads that could carry the load, bridges that could carry the load, and a support element that turned the whole arrangement into a small convoy. You could not hide it. You could not move it quickly. And you certainly could not hand it to an infantry battalion and tell them to work it out. That was the floor. 75 tons was the smallest package the United States had ever managed to wrap around a nuclear warhead. And in the mid-1950s, the Army wrote a requirement asking for something else. Not a lighter cannon, not a smaller truck, a nuclear weapon a rifle squad could carry to a position on foot, set up in minutes, and fire on the authority of the officer standing beside it. No aircraft, no artillery battalion, no call to Washington. The engineers who received that document did the only reasonable thing. They assumed the weight figures contained a decimal error. They did not. Everyone remembers the wrong half of this problem. The famous part is the warhead, shrinking a fission device down to something a man could lift. That was hard, and Los Alamos solved it, and the result was the W-54 Heroes, roughly 50 pounds of plutonium implosion physics packed into a cylinder about the size of a beer keg. Selectable yield somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 tons of TNT equivalent. By nuclear standards, almost nothing. By 1958 standards, a miracle of miniaturization. But a warhead is not a weapon. A warhead is cargo. And the Army had just handed its ordnance engineers a piece of cargo weighing 76 pounds in its final packaging and asked them to throw it 2 kilometers. Think about what that actually demands. A conventional gun that launches a 76-pound projectile is a howitzer. It has a breech, a recoil system, a carriage, and a trail that digs into the earth. Because every gram of forward momentum you give the shell comes back at you as an equal shove in the opposite direction. That reaction force is the reason artillery weighs what it weighs. The gun is not heavy because of the barrel. It is heavy because it has to survive itself. 3 men cannot carry that. So the answer was not a smaller howitzer. The answer was a weapon that never generated the recoil in the first place. The principle is called recoilless, and it works by cheating the equation instead of absorbing it. The barrel is open at both ends. When the propellant burns, part of the gas drives the projectile forward, and a deliberately calculated portion vents backward through the rear of the tube at high velocity. 2 streams of mass leaving in 2 directions. Balance them correctly and the momentum cancels. The weapon barely moves. You get to delete the carriage. You get to delete the recoil mechanism. What is left is a tube on a tripod that 3 men can carry up a hillside. You also get a backblast cone behind the weapon that will kill anyone standing in it. Nothing is free. But recoilless alone still was not enough, because of a second constraint that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with shape. The W-54 was fat. A barrel wide enough to contain that diameter needed walls thick enough to contain the pressure at that diameter, and the weight curve went vertical all over again. So the engineers broke a rule artillery had obeyed since the 15th century. They put the projectile outside the gun. The M388 did not sit inside a bore. It sat on top of one. The warhead was mounted on a long piston, a spigot, and that piston slid down into the launcher tube. Firing drove the piston out, and the piston pushed the warhead ahead of it. The barrel never had to be as wide as the payload. It only had to be as wide as the stem. The result looked less like ordnance than like a mistake. A bulbous, finned bulb balanced on a rod, protruding from the muzzle like something a cartoon villain would order out of a catalog. There is no angle from which it looks real. If you like watching engineers solve a problem by ignoring the rule that created it, that is most of what this channel does. Subscribing helps these find the people who want them. 2 versions went into service, and the difference between them is the entire story compressed into 2 numbers. The M28 was the light one, a 120mm launcher, the complete system around 185 pounds, broken down into loads a 3-man crew could carry on foot. Maximum range, roughly 2 kilometers. the M29 was the heavy one. A 155mm launcher, over 400 pounds, normally mounted on the back of an M151 Jeep, because carrying it any distance was not realistic. Maximum range, roughly 4 kilometers. Same warhead, same crew concept. The only thing the extra 250 pounds bought was distance. And the fact that the Army was willing to pay that much weight for 2 additional kilometers tells you they already understood exactly what the range number was for. Aiming was handled by a spotting rifle bolted to the launcher. 20 millimeters on the M28, 37 millimeters on the M29. Firing a tracer round ballistically matched to the nuclear projectile. You fired the spotter, you watched where it landed, you corrected, and then you committed. The same technique used on conventional recoilless rifles, transplanted onto a weapon where the price of a bad correction belonged to a different category entirely. The warhead had no guidance and no proximity sensor. Detonation came from a mechanical timer, set by hand before launch, based on the crew's estimate of flight time to the target. Get the estimate wrong, and the burst happened at the wrong altitude or in the wrong place. Put all of it together, and the accuracy was, by any conventional standard, terrible. Hundreds of meters of dispersion at maximum range. An artilleryman would have called the system unusable and been right. The Army did not, and not because anyone was pretending the numbers were better than they were. Hitting the target was never the point, because destroying it with the explosion was never how this weapon was supposed to work. 10 to 20 tons of TNT equivalent. Write that number down and look at it, because everything else follows from it. A conventional 155mm shell delivers something in the range of 15 kilograms of high explosive. The Davy Crockett delivered roughly 1,000 times that, which sounds enormous until you set it against the thing it was meant to stop. 20 tons of blast, detonating a few hundred meters off target, does not destroy a tank company. It does not reliably destroy a single tank. Armor is built to survive overpressure. That is most of what armor is for. So if the explosion was not the weapon, what was? Here is the physics that made the entire program possible, and it is strange enough that it took the Cold War to find it. When you scale a nuclear detonation down, blast and radiation do not shrink at the same rate. Blast effects fall away fast, halve the yield, and the destructive radius contracts sharply. But prompt radiation, the burst of neutrons and gamma rays released in the first fraction of a second, does not follow that curve. It is governed by how far those particles travel through air before they are absorbed, and that distance is stubborn. It barely cares how big the bomb was. Push the yield low enough, and the two curves cross. Below roughly a kiloton, the radiation kills further out than the blast does. The Davy Crockett sat well beneath that threshold. Functionally, it was not an explosive weapon that also emitted radiation. It was a radiation weapon that happened to make a bang, which changes what you are aiming at. You are not trying to blow up tanks. You are trying to deliver a lethal neutron dose to the men inside them. Steel armor is excellent at stopping fragments and shaped charged jets. Against fast neutrons, it is mediocre. Dense metal is not what you want for neutron shielding, hydrogen-rich material is, and there is very little of that inside a T-55 apart from the crew. A tank caught by this weapon might drive away. The men in it would take a dose that made survival a question of days rather than decades. The vehicle survives. The crew does not. Multiply that across an advancing formation, and the column does not explode. It simply stops working over the following hours as the people operating it stop being able to operate anything. That was the concept. You are not destroying an attack. You are poisoning a corridor and making a section of the map cost more to cross than it was worth. On paper, elegant. 3 failures broke it. The first was geometry. The lethal radiation envelope of the W-54 reached several hundred meters from the burst. Close in, the dose was fatal within days. Well beyond that, it was still enough to take a man out of the fight. Those distances are a serious fraction of the M28's 2-kilometer maximum, and they are not a small fraction of anything. Which produces the fact this weapon is remembered for. The safe standoff from its own warhead was measured against a launch range that was not much larger than the danger zone. On the light version, at anything short of maximum range, and combat is rarely at maximum range, the crew on the tripod was working inside the envelope of its own weapon. Doctrine acknowledged this by making displacement the first thing you learned. Fire and move. Not tactically, not carefully, immediately. There is a specific quality to a training program that spends more time on leaving a position than on hitting anything from it. The second failure was that the poison did not take sides. Ground level and low altitude bursts irradiate the soil. Neutron flux transmutes elements in the dirt and in the metal debris around it, creating induced radioactivity that stays where it is and keeps emitting long after the flash. The corridor you denied to a Soviet advance was equally denied to your own counterattack, your own resupply, and your own line of withdrawal. The weapon worked by making terrain unusable. Nates would have been using it on terrain it intended to keep. Bavaria, Hesse, the approaches to Frankfurt. West German officers were entirely capable of doing that arithmetic, and through the 1960s they did it publicly and repeatedly. The third failure had nothing to do with physics. Every other American nuclear weapon of the era was protected by distance. A bomber needed a mission order. A missile needed a launch sequence and more than one person. There was always time and always structure, standing between the intent and the detonation. The Davy Crockett had neither. The warhead was physically at the position in the hands of the crew, and the early deployments carried no electronic arming lock, no coded device between a decision on the ground and a nuclear detonation. In a Soviet breakthrough, forward units would be doing precisely what forward units do in a breakthrough. Losing communications, losing contact with higher headquarters, making local decisions under pressure with no way to ask permission. At that moment, the most consequential decision available to the United States belonged to a lieutenant with a dead radio. None of this was discovered afterwards. It was studied, documented, and argued over while the system was still in development. Production went ahead anyway, and the launchers were sent forward to the exact positions where the first shot of a European war was expected to be fired. July 17, 1962. Area 18 of the Nevada test site, a stretch of desert flat enough to see a long way across. The crowd that morning was wrong for a weapons trial. Not larger, more senior. The Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, was standing on that observation point. So was General Maxwell Taylor, the President's own military representative, and within months chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Nobody sends that pair to watch a routine ordnance test. 2 shots ran that month under Operation Sunbeam. Little Feller 2 went first, on July 7th, a static detonation. The device sitting on a low platform, measuring the physics package on its own. 10 days later came Little Feller 1, and this one was the real thing. A Davy Crockett launcher, a live W-54 warhead, an actual firing. The round flew just under 3 kilometers downrange and detonated a few meters above the desert floor at a yield of about 18 tons. It remains the only time a nuclear weapon has been launched from a man-portable delivery system and detonated. Anywhere, by anyone. And nobody standing there knew they were also watching the end of an era. Little Feller. I was the last atmospheric nuclear test ever conducted at the Nevada test site. Within a year, the Limited Test Ban Treaty pushed American testing permanently underground. That flash across the desert was the final one anyone would see there. The date is worth holding on to for another reason. 3 months after he watched a nuclear weapon fired by a Jeep crew, Robert Kennedy was in the room deciding how the United States would answer Soviet missiles in Cuba. Then the system went where it had always been meant to go. Production ran to roughly 2,100 launchers. Units entered service in 1961 and were issued to forward-deployed formations, infantry and armored cavalry in West Germany, sitting on the ground NATO expected to lose first, and units in South Korea covering the approaches south of the demilitarized zone. Both postings share a characteristic. They were places where warning time before a major attack was measured in hours, and where the weapon's entire premise, a nuclear shot released locally in minutes by the men already standing there, was supposed to pay for itself. The warheads were held under separate custody, controlled by specialist detachments, and released to the launchers only under authorization. But the launchers lived with the line companies, stored alongside the mortars and the machine guns, maintained, inspected, and signed for on the same schedule as everything else. That may be the strangest single thing about the program. For 10 years, in garrisons across Bavaria, there were sergeants doing inventory on nuclear weapons the way you would inventory a mortar. But the launcher is not the most important thing this program produced. The warhead is. Because once the W-54 existed, it stopped belonging to any one weapon. It became a component. And the Army and the Air Force immediately began fitting it to problems it was never designed for. The first was demolition. Take the same physics package, put it in a fiberglass carrier with a mechanical timer and a combination lock, and you have the special atomic demolition munition. The SADM was built to be carried by a two-man team, parachuted in or delivered by swimmer, and left behind on a bridge, a tunnel, a dam, or a mountain pass in the path of a Soviet advance. Selectable yield up to roughly a kiloton. It entered service in the mid-1960s and stayed in the inventory until the end of the 1980s. The mission profile is worth stating plainly. 2 men walk in carrying a nuclear weapon in a pack, set a timer, and walk out, assuming they can walk far enough before it functions. The second application was less expected. The Air Force wanted a way to break up an entire formation of incoming Soviet bombers with one shot, and the answer was the AIM-26 Falcon, an air-to-air missile carrying a W-54-derived warhead. Not a nuclear weapon aimed at a country, a nuclear weapon aimed at an aircraft, fired by an interceptor pilot over North America. One warhead, 3 completely different classes of weapon: battlefield artillery, special forces demolition, air defense. That is the real engineering legacy of the miniaturization work, not the Davy Crockett itself. But the moment a nuclear device became small enough to be treated as a module and bolted onto whatever needed one. It is also where the myths come from. Every suitcase bomb story that has circulated since the 1990s traces back to the SADM having been real. The exaggerations barely had to work because the genuine article was already past the edge of what people expected to exist. By the late 1960s, though, the system was in trouble, and what finished it was not a Soviet countermeasure, not a technical fault, and not a budget line. It was a set of war games, played on paper, in which NATO officers ran the scenario the weapon had been built for and looked carefully at what came out the other end. The scenario was straightforward. Warsaw Pact forces cross into West Germany. NATO responds the way its doctrine said it would, or tactical nuclear weapons used on the battlefield against military targets on the defender's own soil. Then somebody counted. The exercise everyone still cites came in 1955, 6 years before the Davy Crockett entered service, and it set the terms for every argument that followed. Carte blanche simulated 335 nuclear detonations over German territory across 2 days. The estimate that came out of it was more than 1.5 million German civilians killed and several million more injured. That figure excluded fallout entirely because fallout was harder to model. and in NATO's own terms, the exercise was a success. The defense held. That result landed in Bonn like a diagnosis. What it exposed was not a flaw in the plan. It was the plan, described accurately for the first time. The strategy for defending West Germany involved destroying West Germany. The country would be liberated in roughly the sense that a tumor is removed. Every study through the following decade arrived at the same shape of conclusion, and the Davy Crockett sat at the center of the problem, because it was the weapon that made the first shot easiest to fire. That is the part worth understanding, and it is the opposite of how this story usually gets told. The real danger was never the crew standing inside its own radiation envelope. That was a survivable design flaw. You accept the losses, you train the displacement, you move on. The danger was structural, and it came from the weapon working exactly as intended. Nuclear escalation is a ladder, and every rung on it depends on the other side being able to read what you just did. A strategic strike is unambiguous. A submarine launch is unambiguous. But a 20-ton detonation on a road junction in Hesse communicates nothing at all. Moscow does not receive a message saying this was small, this was local, and we would like to keep it that way. Moscow receives the fact that nuclear weapons are now being used against its forces. Soviet doctrine of the period was explicit on this point. It did not recognize the category of a limited nuclear war in Europe. Planning assumed that once nuclear weapons were employed at any level, the exchange escalated. There was no rung between the launcher on the tripod and everything above it. So the weapon built to prevent a war in Central Europe was on close inspection the most efficient available mechanism for starting a global one, released by the lowest rank in the chain. The response came in two forms. The first was technical. In 1962, President Kennedy directed that American nuclear weapons deployed in Europe be fitted with coded arming devices, permissive action links, locks requiring authorization from above before a warhead could function at all. It is not an accident that this happened while weapons like the Davy Crockett were sitting in forward units. The entire modern architecture of nuclear command and control, all the codes and authorization chains we now take as obvious, was built substantially in response to weapons that were too easy to use. The second was doctrinal. In 1967, NATO formally abandoned massive retaliation and adopted flexible response. The principle that an attack is met at a proportionate level, conventional forces first, with nuclear release held back as a deliberate political decision rather than a battlefield reflex. That doctrine had no place for a nuclear weapon issued to a rifle company. The Davy Crockett came out of Europe in 1967. It was withdrawn from service entirely by 1971. There was no incident, no scandal, no dramatic moment. The launchers were collected, the warheads returned, the units re-equipped with conventional weapons. The smallest nuclear weapon ever fielded was ended by paperwork. And here is what it left behind. The W-54 established the practical floor of nuclear miniaturization. Around 50 pounds, around 10 tons of yield. That floor has not moved since. Not because the engineering became impossible, it did not. Because every nuclear power that examined the problem afterwards reached the conclusion the Americans reached first. A nuclear weapon small enough to be used casually is not a more usable weapon. It is a weapon that removes the pause between deciding and doing, and that pause is the only thing that has kept the arsenals quiet for 80 years. The limit was never technical. It was a decision, and it has been renewed by silence ever since. If this is the kind of history you want more of, objects that explain the decade that produced them, there is a growing archive of it here, and subscribing is what keeps it coming. You can still stand next to one. A handful survive in museum collections in the United States, roped off, dark green, entirely unremarkable. The round comes up to about knee height. People walk past it, looking for the exhibit. And the last thing to understand is this. The Davy Crockett was not retired because it was a bad weapon. It performed. It fired. It detonated. It did what the specification asked of it. It was retired because it was good. Because it took the most consequential decision a nation can make and reduced it to a task a corporal could complete in 90 seconds. That was the requirement. That was the achievement. It turned out to be the one capability nobody could afford to have.